It was just past 1 o'clock in the morning on November 27, 2019, and most residents of Port Neches, Texas were asleep in their beds, enjoying the quiet hours before Thanksgiving Day. The small industrial city of about 13,000 people sat nestled along the Neches River in Jefferson County, part of the sprawling petrochemical corridor that stretches along the Gulf Coast from Houston to Louisiana. The night was cool and clear, temperatures in the mid-50s, typical for late November in southeast Texas. Inside the TPC Group chemical plant on the northern edge of town, the night shift was monitoring production of butadiene, a colorless gas used to manufacture synthetic rubber for tires, plastics, and numerous other products. The facility had been producing petrochemicals since 1943, through multiple ownership changes and expansions, a fixture of the local economy that employed hundreds of workers and generated millions in tax revenue. Everything appeared routine that night. Just another shift at a plant that had operated for 76 years. The TPC Group Port Neches facility sprawled across acres of industrial property, a forest of towers, pipes, reactors, and storage tanks connected by miles of piping carrying volatile hydrocarbons under high pressure and temperature. The plant's primary product was butadiene, a highly flammable hydrocarbon with a distinctive gasoline-like odor. Butadiene is extracted from crude oil through a complex process called steam cracking, where hydrocarbon feedstocks are heated to extreme temperatures, causing molecular bonds to break and reform. The process requires massive equipment operating under conditions that would terrify most people, pressures exceeding 1,000 pounds per square inch, temperatures reaching 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, and throughput measured in millions of pounds per day. The plant had been designed and built in the 1940s using technology and materials standards from that era, then modified, expanded, and upgraded numerous times over subsequent decades, creating a patchwork facility where vintage equipment from the World War II era operated alongside more modern systems installed in recent years. What made TPC Group's operation particularly hazardous was the chemical they produced. Butadiene isn't just flammable, it's explosively flammable, with a vapor that's heavier than air and can travel considerable distances to find ignition sources. The molecule contains double bonds between carbon atoms, making it chemically reactive and prone to polymerization, a process where individual molecules link together to form long chains. Under certain conditions, particularly when oxygen is present, butadiene can undergo runaway polymerization reactions that generate heat and pressure, potentially rupturing equipment. The industry had known about this hazard for decades and had developed procedures to prevent it, but those procedures required diligent implementation and constant vigilance. The specific problem that would destroy TPC Group's Port Neches plant had a deceptively whimsical name: popcorn polymer. When butadiene contacts oxygen in confined spaces like pipes or vessels, it forms peroxides. These peroxides then catalyze further polymerization reactions, creating a solid material with a distinctive porous, bubbly appearance resembling popcorn. The polymer grows slowly at first, forming on pipe walls and in equipment crevices. As it grows, it absorbs more butadiene and undergoes additional polymerization, expanding in volume. The expansion is relentless. Like water freezing in a pipe, the growing polymer generates enormous pressure against the pipe walls. Eventually, if left unchecked, the pressure exceeds the pipe's strength and the pipe ruptures, releasing whatever it contains, often under high pressure, sometimes with catastrophic results. The industry had learned about popcorn polymer the hard way, through previous incidents at other facilities. The solution was straightforward in principle but demanding in practice. Regular flushing of all process piping with inert gases removed oxygen and prevented polymer formation. Dead legs, sections of piping that don't have continuous flow, required special attention because material could stagnate there, providing ideal conditions for polymerization. Monthly flushing procedures were considered industry best practice, documented in technical literature, required by insurance companies, and mandated by regulatory agencies. TPC Group had these procedures written in their own safety manuals and operating protocols. The procedures existed on paper, formally documented and officially approved. But procedures written in manuals are only effective when they're actually implemented in the field, consistently, month after month, year after year. Even when production pressures mount and maintenance budgets shrink and managers prioritize output over protocol. At some point in the months or possibly years before November 2019, TPC Group's Port Neches facility stopped consistently implementing the monthly flushing procedures for their butadiene processing equipment. Whether this was a conscious cost-cutting decision, a gradual erosion of safety culture, simple negligence, or some combination of factors, investigators would later debate. What is undeniable is that the procedures existed, management knew they existed, operators knew they existed, but they weren't being followed. Inside miles of process piping, in dead legs and low-flow sections, oxygen slowly infiltrated. Chemical reactions began. Popcorn polymer started forming, molecule by molecule, growing imperceptibly day by day. The polymer was invisible from outside the pipes, hidden within the steel tubes that snaked throughout the facility. No one opened the pipes to inspect. No one performed the flushing that would have removed the oxygen and prevented polymer formation. The danger grew silently, unseen, a time bomb counting down to detonation. The facility had experienced this exact problem before, a fact that makes TPC Group's negligence particularly inexcusable. In 1999, 20 years earlier, when the plant was owned by a different company, a popcorn polymer buildup had caused a pipe rupture. The incident hadn't caused an explosion or fire, but it had been serious enough to document, investigate, and report through industry safety channels. The lesson should have been clear: this facility's equipment and processes were susceptible to popcorn polymer formation, making diligent implementation of prevention procedures absolutely critical. But institutional memory is fragile in industrial facilities. Workers retire or change jobs. Managers move on, ownership changes. Safety cultures erode. By 2019, the 1999 incident might as well have never happened. The written procedures remained in the safety manuals, but the hard-earned knowledge of why those procedures mattered had evaporated. Making matters worse, TPC Group's facility had numerous dead legs, sections of piping that connected to the main process lines but didn't have continuous flow. Dead legs are sometimes necessary for operational reasons, providing access points for sampling, instrumentation, or connecting equipment that only operates intermittently. But dead legs are also perfect breeding grounds for problems because material can stagnate there indefinitely. In active process lines, fresh material constantly flows, minimizing oxygen contact time. In dead legs, material sits motionless, providing maximum opportunity for oxygen infiltration and polymerization. Industry best practices called for minimizing dead legs, implementing special monitoring for unavoidable ones, and ensuring extra diligent flushing of these vulnerable sections. TPC Group's facility had dead legs throughout their butadiene processing equipment, many dating back decades to the plant's original construction, and the evidence suggests they weren't implementing the special procedures these vulnerable sections required. As 2019 progressed, the polymer continued growing inside TPC Group's process equipment. By November, sections of pipe contained substantial polymer deposits. The deposits were expanding, generating pressure, stressing the pipe walls. The equipment was failing in slow motion, the failure invisible from outside but accelerating toward catastrophe. On November 27, somewhere in the butadiene processing area, likely in or near a dead leg section, a pipe finally yielded to the pressure. The steel ruptured. Approximately 6,000 gallons of butadiene escaped, flashing instantly from liquid to vapor as pressure dropped, creating an explosive cloud of hydrocarbon gas mixing with air. What happens next when large quantities of flammable vapor mix with air and find an ignition source is well understood by chemical engineers. The mixture doesn't just burn, it detonates, undergoing deflagration, where the flame front moves through the vapor cloud at supersonic speeds, generating a shockwave that propagates outward with devastating force. At 1 a.m., the butadiene cloud found an ignition source, likely a spark or hot surface in the industrial environment. The resulting explosion registered as a 3.6 magnitude earthquake on seismographs at Texas A&M University, 60 miles away. The blast wave radiated outward at thousands of feet per second, far faster than sound, creating an overpressure pulse that shattered windows, collapsed structures, and injured anyone close enough to the epicenter. Inside the plant, the explosion destroyed portions of the facility's south processing unit where the rupture had occurred. Steel towers weighing hundreds of tons were toppled, piping was shredded. Equipment was scattered like toys. 3 TPC Group employees working in the area were knocked down by the blast wave, suffering injuries including perforated eardrums, concussions, burns, and broken teeth. They were extraordinarily fortunate to survive. A security contractor was also injured. The explosion ignited fires throughout the damaged area, as ruptured pipes released additional flammable materials that immediately combusted. Within seconds, multiple fires were burning across the facility, feeding on the chemicals released from damaged equipment. The explosion that residents of Port Neches experienced at 1 a.m. on November 27 was unlike anything most had encountered. The pressure wave hit houses like an invisible fist, rattling walls, shattering windows, knocking pictures off walls, throwing people from their beds. One resident described being asleep when suddenly the entire house shook violently, windows exploding inward, showering glass across rooms where his family slept. Another reported his front door was blown open, every window in his house shattered, and his ears were left ringing so severely he couldn't hear normally for days. The sound was overwhelming, not just loud but felt physically, a concussive force that pressed against bodies and buildings with enormous power. Residents stumbled outside into darkness, confused and frightened, trying to understand what had happened. Looking toward the TPC Group plant, they saw a horrifying sight, an enormous fireball rising into the night sky, orange and red flames illuminating the area like daylight, thick black smoke beginning to pour upward in towering columns. The fire was clearly massive, far beyond anything local fire departments could handle. People started calling 911. Within minutes, emergency dispatchers were overwhelmed with calls from across Port Neches and neighboring communities, all reporting an explosion, fire, shattered windows and injuries. The Port Neches Fire Department responded within minutes but immediately recognized this was beyond their capabilities.
The TPC Group facility was fully involved in fire, with multiple ignition points spread across the damaged areas. Chemical fires at industrial facilities present unique challenges. Water is often ineffective or even dangerous when applied to burning hydrocarbons. Special foam concentrates are needed. The facility's own firefighting infrastructure, the monitors, foam systems, and water supplies designed to combat industrial fires, had been damaged or destroyed by the explosion. Making matters worse, additional explosions were possible. Ruptured equipment continued releasing flammable materials. Storage tanks heated by nearby fires could fail catastrophically. The firefighters had to balance the need to control the fire against the risk of additional explosions killing responders. At 1:13 a.m., barely 13 minutes after the initial explosion, a second massive explosion rocked the facility. Another section of damaged piping or equipment had failed, releasing more flammable vapor that detonated. The second explosion was slightly less powerful than the first but still devastating, registering clearly on seismographs and causing additional damage across Port Neches. Residents who had just emerged from their homes after the first explosion found themselves running for cover as another shockwave struck. Windows that had survived the first blast shattered in the second. Buildings already damaged suffered additional destruction. The message was clear: this was far from over, and anyone near the facility was in grave danger. Emergency management officials made the critical decision to order evacuations. Initially, everyone within a 1-mile radius of the TPC Group plant was ordered to leave immediately. As the situation developed and fires continued burning, the evacuation zone was expanded repeatedly. By morning, approximately 60,000 residents from Port Neches, Nederland, Groves, and parts of Port Arthur had been ordered to evacuate, creating a mass exodus from southeast Texas on Thanksgiving Eve. The evacuation strained every resource. Shelters were opened in schools and community centers, hotels throughout the region filled with displaced residents. Many families drove to relatives' homes in Houston or Louisiana, turning what should have been Thanksgiving travel into emergency flight. Some residents refused to leave, either unaware of the danger, unable to evacuate for logistical reasons, or simply determined to protect their property. The fires continued burning for days. TPC Group and responding agencies focused on preventing catastrophic tank failures and controlling the spread of fire to undamaged portions of the facility, essentially writing off the destroyed sections and focusing on containment. Foam was applied by the millions of gallons. Water was pumped from the nearby river continuously. The smoke plume was visible for miles, a toxic column of black smoke carrying combustion products, unburned hydrocarbons, and particulates across the region. Air quality monitoring detected elevated levels of benzene, butadiene, and other volatile organic compounds downwind of the fire. Residents were warned to stay indoors, close windows, and turn off air conditioning systems that might draw in contaminated air. As dawn broke on Thanksgiving Day, the scale of destruction became visible. Port Neches looked like a war zone. Houses closest to the plant had been severely damaged, some rendered uninhabitable. Windows were shattered for miles in every direction, with over 50,000 homes and buildings reporting damage. Roofs had been damaged by the blast pressure. Doors had been blown off hinges. Vehicles in driveways had been pelted with debris. Trees nearest the plant had been stripped of foliage by the blast wave. Residents returning to assess damage during brief periods when evacuation orders were lifted found their homes filled with broken glass, possessions scattered by the shock wave, and the acrid smell of smoke permeating everything. The human toll extended far beyond the immediate injuries. Families were displaced from their homes during what should have been a holiday celebration. Children were traumatized by the violence of the explosions.
Elderly residents with medical needs struggled with evacuation. Pets were lost in the chaos. Businesses were shuttered, costing workers income during an already difficult time. The psychological impact was profound and lasting. Residents of Port Neches had lived peacefully next to the TPC Group facility for decades, growing accustomed to the industrial presence, trusting that the company operated safely. That trust was shattered as violently as their windows. People who had felt secure in their homes now felt vulnerable, unable to sleep without startling at every noise, anxious whenever they saw the plant's towers looming over their neighborhood. The mandatory evacuation order was lifted on November 29, allowing most residents to return home, but the fires at the TPC Group facility continued burning. The company and responding agencies worked methodically through the damaged areas, extinguishing fires, securing hazards, and beginning the process of assessment. The scope of destruction was extraordinary. Entire process units had been destroyed, reduced to tangled wreckage of steel and piping. Equipment that had operated continuously for decades was gone, obliterated in seconds. The facility's south unit, where the initial rupture occurred, was completely destroyed. Adjacent areas suffered varying degrees of damage from fire, blast effects, and debris impact. The investigation began almost immediately, with multiple agencies converging on Port Neches to determine what had caused the disaster. The U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board, known as the CSB, took the lead on the technical investigation. Their mission was to determine the root causes of chemical accidents and make recommendations to prevent future incidents. The CSB team arrived within days and began the methodical work of collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, examining damaged equipment, and reviewing TPC Group's safety records and operating procedures. What they would eventually uncover was a case study in how routine negligence, repeated over sufficient time, inevitably leads to catastrophe. The Environmental Protection Agency launched its own investigation focused on regulatory compliance and environmental impacts. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration examined workplace safety violations. The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality assessed air quality and environmental damage. Local and state authorities investigated the response and evacuation procedures. The convergence of investigative attention was unusual for industrial accidents but warranted, given the scale of destruction and the number of people affected. As investigators sifted through the wreckage and examined TPC Group's records, a damning picture emerged. The company had written procedures requiring monthly flushing of process piping to prevent popcorn polymer formation. These procedures were documented in safety manuals, acknowledged in training materials, and required by insurance policies and regulatory permits. But the procedures weren't being implemented. Maintenance records showed gaps where monthly flushings should have occurred, but didn't. Operators interviewed by investigators confirmed that the procedures existed, but weren't consistently followed. Managers couldn't explain why the procedures had been neglected, offering vague statements about operational priorities and resource constraints that rang hollow in the aftermath of the explosion. The investigation revealed that TPC Group had been aware of the popcorn polymer hazard specific to their facility. The 1999 pipe rupture incident was documented in the plant's historical records, though buried in archives that new employees and managers apparently never reviewed. Industry publications had published articles about popcorn polymer incidents at other facilities. Insurance company safety audits had specifically questioned TPC Group's flushing procedures. State regulators had cited the facility for related violations in previous years. The warning signs had been everywhere, flashing red for anyone paying attention, but TPC Group had systematically ignored or minimized them, prioritizing continued production over implementing the preventive maintenance their own procedures required. Even more disturbing was the discovery that TPC Group's facility had numerous dead legs throughout the butadiene processing equipment, and that these vulnerable sections received no special monitoring or maintenance attention. Engineering drawings showed dead legs that had existed since the plant's original construction in the 1940s, plus additional ones created during subsequent expansions and modifications. The company had no systematic inventory of dead legs, no special procedures for monitoring them, and no enhanced flushing protocols for these high-risk areas. The investigation found dead legs containing substantial popcorn polymer deposits that had been growing for years, hidden within pipes that no one ever inspected because inspection would have required shutting down production. The CSB's investigation also examined TPC Group's broader safety culture and found systemic problems. The facility had a history of environmental violations,
accumulating citations from state and federal regulators over multiple years. The facility had been out of compliance with the Clean Air Act for 12 consecutive quarters before the explosion, a remarkable record of persistent violation. Previous incidents, though less severe than the 2019 explosion, had occurred and been inadequately investigated, with corrective actions that were superficial rather than addressing root causes. Employees reported feeling pressure to maintain production even when equipment problems emerged, creating an environment where raising safety concerns could jeopardize one's job. The financial pressures facing TPC Group likely contributed to the neglect that caused the disaster. The company was privately owned by two private equity firms, First Reserve Corporation and SK Capital Partners, which had acquired TPC Group in 2012 for approximately $850 million. Private equity ownership often brings pressure to maximize profitability and cash flow, sometimes at the expense of long-term investments in maintenance and safety. TPC Group's financial performance in the years before the explosion was reportedly strong, generating substantial profits for its owners, but those profits apparently didn't translate into adequate investment in preventive maintenance and safety programs. The monthly flushing procedures that could have prevented the disaster cost relatively little to implement, requiring mainly labor time and operational discipline, but they apparently conflicted with management's focus on maximizing production uptime and minimizing operational disruptions. As the investigation progressed, the legal consequences for TPC Group mounted rapidly. Residents and businesses filed thousands of lawsuits seeking compensation for property damage, lost income, medical expenses, and emotional distress. The lawsuits eventually numbered over 5,000, representing nearly every affected property owner in Port Neches and surrounding communities. The claims collectively sought damages in the hundreds of millions of dollars. TPC Group's insurance coverage, while substantial, was clearly insufficient to cover the potential liability. The company faced criminal investigations by federal and state prosecutors examining whether the violations rose to the level of criminal negligence. The environmental damage from the explosion and subsequent fires was severe and long-lasting. The incident released more than 11 million pounds of extremely hazardous substances into the environment, including butadiene, benzene, and numerous other volatile organic compounds. The massive release created an environmental catastrophe affecting air quality across southeast Texas for days. Soil contamination extended across the facility property and potentially onto adjacent lands. The Neches River, already stressed by decades of industrial pollution, received additional contamination from firefighting runoff and damaged equipment drainage. The long-term health impacts on residents exposed to the toxic smoke plume remained unknown but concerning, particularly for vulnerable populations like children, elderly residents, and those with pre-existing respiratory conditions. The economic impact extended far beyond the direct costs of property damage and legal settlements. TPC Group's Port Neches facility, once a major producer of butadiene supplying customers across North America, was effectively destroyed. The company announced it would not rebuild the production facilities, instead converting the site to a terminal operation for receiving and distributing chemicals produced elsewhere. Hundreds of jobs were eliminated, devastating families who had depended on those well-paying industrial positions for their livelihoods. The lost tax revenue affected Port Neches' municipal budget, forcing cuts in services and deferral of capital projects. Surrounding businesses suffered from reduced economic activity as the plant's workforce disappeared and construction workers who had supported the facility moved elsewhere. For TPC Group as a corporation, the disaster proved financially fatal. The combination of massive property losses, legal liabilities, lost production capacity, environmental remediation costs, and criminal penalties created obligations the company couldn't meet. On June 1, 2022, approximately 2.5 years after the explosion, TPC Group filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The bankruptcy filing cited multiple factors including the Port Neches explosion, the COVID-19 pandemic, Winter Storm Uri in 2021, and rising commodity costs, but the explosion was clearly the primary cause. The bankruptcy proceedings became the mechanism for resolving the thousands of civil lawsuits, with claimants becoming creditors in the bankruptcy case. The process ensured that compensation would be delayed for years and likely reduced from what full litigation might have awarded. The criminal case against TPC Group concluded in May 2024 when the company pleaded guilty to knowingly failing to implement its own written operating procedures in violation of the Clean Air Act. The plea agreement included over $30 million in criminal fines and civil penalties, a one-year probation term, and a requirement to publish a public apology. More significantly, the agreement required TPC Group to spend approximately $80 million implementing improvements to its risk management programs and safety systems at its remaining facilities in Port Neches and Houston. The guilty plea and associated penalties sent a message to the petrochemical industry that regulatory violations leading to major incidents would face serious criminal consequences, not just civil liability. The human stories from the disaster reveal the personal toll of corporate negligence. A young family living 2 blocks from the plant described how the explosion threw them from their beds in the middle of the night, their 2-year-old daughter screaming in terror as windows exploded inward, showering glass across her bedroom. The father grabbed his daughter and ran outside, finding their street filled with dazed neighbors, all looking at the towering fireball where the plant used to be. They evacuated to Houston, staying with relatives, returning days later to find their house damaged and uninhabitable. They lived in hotels for 3 months while repairs were completed, the entire experience traumatizing their daughter, who developed anxiety and sleep problems that persisted for years. An elderly couple who had lived in Port Neches for 40 years, raising their family in a house just a half-mile from the plant, suffered severe damage to their home. The husband, a retired TPC Group employee who had worked at the facility for 30 years before retiring, felt betrayed by the company he had served faithfully. He had believed the safety procedures he had followed during his career were still being implemented, that the company maintained the same standards he remembered. Discovering that basic preventive maintenance had been neglected, causing an explosion that damaged his home and threatened his family, shattered his faith in corporate responsibility. A business owner operating a coffee shop in downtown Port Neches described hearing the explosion and seeing her shop's front windows blow inward. She spent Thanksgiving Day boarding up windows and cleaning debris instead of celebrating with family. The shop remained closed for a week, costing her income during what should have been a busy holiday shopping season. Even after reopening, business was slow as the mandatory evacuation had disrupted normal patterns and many residents remained wary about returning to daily activities. The financial losses from the explosion pushed her business into debt from which it never recovered, forcing closure 6 months later. The psychological impact on Port Neches residents extended well beyond the immediate trauma of the explosion and evacuation. Many developed symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance and anxiety. The sound of thunder or fireworks could trigger panic attacks in people who had lived through the explosions. Parents reported their children refusing to sleep in their own bedrooms, afraid of another explosion shattering windows while they slept. Some families couldn't continue living in Port Neches despite having roots in the community spanning generations, the constant proximity to the chemical plant creating unbearable anxiety. They sold their homes, often at losses because property values had plummeted after the disaster, and relocated to other communities, refugees from industrial negligence. The first responders and emergency workers who dealt with the disaster also suffered lasting effects. Firefighters who battled the blazes for days, working in contaminated smoke while worried about additional explosions, developed respiratory problems and anxiety disorders. Emergency management officials who coordinated the massive evacuation worked 36-hour shifts under enormous pressure, making life or death decisions with incomplete information, an experience that haunted some of them long after. The 911 dispatchers who handled hundreds of panicked calls that night, hearing the fear in residents' voices, struggled with vicarious trauma from the experience. The broader petrochemical industry faced intense scrutiny following the TPC Group disaster. The explosion demonstrated that even well-known hazards like popcorn polymer, with established prevention procedures documented for decades, could still cause catastrophic accidents when companies failed to implement those procedures. Industry associations issued advisories reminding member companies about popcorn polymer risks and emphasizing the importance of consistent implementation of preventive maintenance. Insurance companies increased scrutiny of petrochemical facilities' maintenance practices, requiring detailed documentation of flushing procedures and threatening coverage cancellation for non-compliance. Regulatory agencies enhanced enforcement, conducting surprise inspections focused specifically on whether written procedures were actually being followed in the field. The disaster prompted congressional attention to chemical safety regulation. Lawmakers questioned why a facility could be out of compliance with the Clean Air Act for 12 consecutive quarters before finally exploding, suggesting that regulatory enforcement was too weak to deter violations. Proposals emerged to strengthen the Chemical Safety Board's authority, increase penalties for violations, and require more frequent independent safety audits of high-hazard facilities. The petrochemical industry lobbied against increased regulation, arguing that the TPC Group incident was an outlier, and that increased regulation would burden responsible companies that already implemented proper safety programs. The debate continues, with TPC Group's explosion serving as a recurring example in arguments for stronger oversight. The environmental justice dimensions of the disaster also received attention. Port Neches, like many petrochemical communities along the Gulf Coast, has significant environmental justice concerns. Lower-income and minority communities often live in closest proximity to industrial facilities, bearing disproportionate risk from accidents and routine emissions. The TPC Group explosion affected everyone within its blast radius, but the residents living closest to the plant, those who suffered the worst damage and trauma, were disproportionately working-class families who couldn't afford homes in more distant neighborhoods. Environmental justice advocates argued that the disaster illustrated systemic problems with allowing residential development near high-hazard industrial facilities, and with the political economy that makes such arrangements seem normal and acceptable. The memorial and healing process for Port Neches has been gradual and incomplete. No permanent memorial exists yet for the disaster, unlike many industrial accidents that receive official recognition with monuments or commemorative sites. The lack of deaths, while fortunate, perhaps makes the disaster less tangible than incidents where lives were lost. But the destruction was real, the trauma was real, and the ongoing impacts on the community continue years later. Annual gatherings on the anniversary bring together survivors, first responders and community members to remember and support each other. Support groups for affected residents meet regularly, providing spaces for people to share experiences and coping strategies with others who understand what they endured. The TPC Group facility site remains partially operational but dramatically changed. The destroyed process units were never rebuilt. The facility now functions primarily as a terminal for receiving and distributing chemicals, employing a fraction of its previous workforce. The massive towers and complex piping that once defined the facility's skyline are gone, replaced by simpler storage and distribution infrastructure. For some residents, the reduced industrial presence brings relief, a sense that at least the specific equipment that exploded won't threaten them again. For others, particularly former TPC Group employees who lost their jobs, the diminished facility represents economic loss and the end of an industrial era. The lessons from the TPC Group Port Neches disaster are straightforward but apparently difficult for some companies to internalize. Written safety procedures are worthless if not consistently implemented. Well-known hazards remain dangerous regardless of how long operations have continued without incident. Cost pressures and production priorities cannot justify neglecting preventive maintenance for safety-critical systems. Prior incidents, whether at one's own facility or others in the industry, must be taken seriously as warnings of what can happen when safeguards fail. Regulatory violations are symptoms of deeper cultural problems that need addressing before they manifest as catastrophic accidents. These lessons aren't new or revolutionary, they've been learned and relearned through decades of industrial disasters. Yet companies continue to neglect them, and communities continue to pay the price. Today, more than 5 years after the explosion, Port Neches continues recovering. Homes have been repaired. Windows have been replaced. Property values have slowly recovered, though they remain depressed compared to pre-disaster levels. Some businesses closed permanently while others adapted and survived. New families have moved into the community, unaware of or undeterred by the disaster's history. Life has resumed a semblance of normalcy, the surface wounds healed even as deeper scars remain. But residents haven't forgotten. They remember being thrown from their beds at 1 a.m. They remember the fireball lighting the sky. They remember the evacuations, the uncertainty, the fear, and they remember that it was preventable. That simple maintenance procedures consistently implemented would have prevented everything, a fact that makes the trauma even harder to process. The TPC Group Port Neches explosion stands as a testament to what happens when profit-driven negligence meets industrial hazard. The disaster was entirely predictable and completely preventable. Every element necessary to prevent it existed: the technical knowledge about popcorn polymer, the written procedures for prevention, the regulatory requirements mandating implementation, the prior incidents demonstrating the consequences of failure. What was missing was corporate commitment to actually doing what they knew needed to be done, month after month, year after year, even when it conflicted with production schedules and quarterly profit targets. That failure cost TPC Group its facility and its corporate existence. It cost Port Neches residents their sense of security and their trust in industrial neighbors. It cost workers their jobs. It cost taxpayers millions in emergency response and long-term impacts. The company's foolish neglect of routine maintenance destroyed far more than just plant equipment. It destroyed a community's peace, families' well-being, and any remaining illusion that self-regulation and voluntary compliance are sufficient to protect communities from industrial hazards.